Mr. Jacques Marion is our next presenter. Mr. Marion worked in China and Russia in the past as Secretary General of UPF Eurasia. He is currently co-chairman of the Europe-Eurasia Middle East chapter of the Universal Peace Federation. Monsieur Marion, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Gudrun. Good morning. Let me just share I have a brief PowerPoint with just some slides to illustrate my talk. Good morning, Dr. Yang, Dr. Petrovsky, and Dr. Kim, dear participants. I've been asked to make a presentation in this webinar representing Europe UPF and bring a European viewpoint. Actually, I need to learn from you. You are the experts, and I'm really happy to have your very factual presentations. This is a very important issue for us in the coming years, as we all know. Korea has long been coveted by great powers because of its strategic location, as illustrated in this caricature by French artist Georges Bigot in 1887, showing China, Japan, and Russia's eagerness to catch Korea. You see my slides, right? You see the slides? Yes, okay. According to scholars, a peaceful reunification would realize political stability and multilateral cooperation in East Asia, then would lead to a reduction of military tension in the region, and peace would, of course, bring economic development of Korea and the end of the Cold War and the establishment of an East Asian community, which would have, of course, a great impact on the world level. It's common knowledge that if the power of South Korean technology and natural resources in the North were combined, the unified Korea would become a very powerful nation in Asia. But this could not be done without the active involvement of the four major powers surrounding the Korean Peninsula: China, Russia, the USA, and Japan, because these powers were in great part cause of the division of Korea. Their interests are at stake, and we cannot conceive of Korean reunification without their involvement. Briefly speaking, what could be these powers' expectations and concerns? Of course, all of these nations, these four nations, would benefit greatly from the creation of an East Asian economic community with a powerful Korea. That would be a great market for the United States, Japan, China. I think Russia would then have some, incentive to develop its own gigantic Far Eastern region. Russia could sell its gas and oil to Korea. I think it already proposed to build a pipeline, if I'm not mistaken, to the peninsula. But also these nations have a great concern, series of concerns. Which political system would a unified Korea adopt? Will it be a pro-USA, pro-China? Will it be anti-Japan? On the other hand, what will be the cost, and probably a very substantial cost, that they have to bear to support the process of unification? Besides, each of these nations have also historical or territorial conflicts with either North or South Korea. For instance, some island issue with Japan, or in the case of China, some Korean Chinese province or Manchuria, and so on. And of course, one great concern would be defense and security matters because of the nuclear issue. Regarding the question of North and South Korea, I will stop here. I will come back to share afterwards because I don't have that slide for the rest of my speech, just at the end. Regarding the question of North and South Korean unification challenges, I will turn for a summary to Professor Rüdiger Frank, who is a professor of East Asian Economy and Society and head of Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Vienna. He's a top expert on North Korea, where he lived and studied. He analyzed the question of Korean unification in light of Germany's experience. I will just share a few points. He wrote some very interesting papers. One central issue for Korean reunification, of course, would be its cost. I'm quoting Professor Frank, the National Assembly Budget Office, this is 2015, estimates that the total unification cost for the 45 years from 2016 to 2060 will amount to about $9.2 trillion. He thinks himself this cost is a bit overstated. In fact, he has quite a positive view. of reunification. But he adds this point. He says, if South Korea has a reason to be afraid of unification, it's not because of its huge costs, but because of a massive structural change that will result in dramatic loss of jobs and tax income in the South. This points to the fact that the costs and the benefits of Korean unification will not be distributed equally among all Koreans. Then he lists a few points on how Korean unification would differ from German reunification. He compares both, and that tends to highlight the fact that Korean reunification, in a sense, will be more challenging than German reunification. I will just cite a few points that he makes regarding attitudes of people, of local people towards unification. Germany's division was by many seen as a form of punishment for the German aggression in World War II. But the Koreans, they are the victims. They were the victims of aggression, and thus they regard division as a great injustice. So this adds nationalist undertone to the unification debate. Unlike in the case of Germany, Koreans fought and killed each other during the Korean War. Therefore, dealing with the legacy of the past will be a much bigger challenge for Korea. Regarding the cost of unification, North and South Korea have economic structures that are complementary in many ways. For instance, South Korea's capability to extract and process mineral resources of the North. This will provide opportunities for an immediate economic growth in the North that was not there, that was absent in East Germany. So that would also help ultimately to reduce unification costs. The economic gap also between West and East Germany was mainly in the form of luxury goods like cars and so on. But for North Koreans, they're still primarily interested in a stable supply of food and other basic needs, which also would lower unification costs. Regarding the relative power of both sides in the conflict, in Germany, only the West officially supported unification. But in Korea, unification is officially the top political objective of both sides, according both North and South, according to their respective constitution. Therefore, if Korean unification proceeds, South Korea will find it harder to impose its own position on the North. In Korea also, both sides have for decades been promoting their competing unification plans. Therefore, any attempt by South Korea to impose its own system on the North, like in a sense West Germany did on East Germany, then any attempt will be faced, of course, with Kim Il-sung's own proposal. Regarding the process of unification, the potential for violence, he thinks, is greater in the case of Korea. He said it was a big surprise that to many, for many people, that there was no major acts of revenge during the German unification process. But he thinks the situation is unlikely to remain as calm in the Korean case. The Soviets did not allow East Germans to have any nuclear weapons, but North Korea already claims to be a nuclear power. Therefore, the risk of a major military conflict is there in case of political destabilization. Of course, also, Germany was only divided for 40 years, less than 2 generations, whereas Korea has been divided for 73 years. That means almost 3 generations. And that's why Dr. Kim mentioned the young generation's interest in unification is decreasing. So harmonization will take longer and will be harder to achieve. Also, the population ratio between East Germans and West Germans, West and East Germans was 1:4, but for South and North Koreans, it's 1:2. That means economically, there are fewer South Koreans who would have to finance and support more North Koreans. So also politically, an opposition party, for instance, that is based in the North would have much more weight, greater weight in a joint parliament than in any East German equivalent. So, these are a few points that I mentioned out of a long paper several papers actually, that highlight, in a sense, the many challenges that, Korean reunification would face, or at least some unique aspect of it, and which to some extent explain the standstill that we are today. So this brings me to conclude with the title of this webinar, The Quest for a New Vision. There has been a first attempt, a first path at Korean unification that was attempted by force. There was an attempt by force through the Korean War in the 1950s. The war, however, brought enormous damage, and nobody definitely wants a second war on the peninsula. The second attempt has been unification by competition. That means whoever win in the competition of national development and international recognition will absorb the other one. So this is, in a sense, a path of absorption, an attempt of absorbing the other side. But this has lasted for 70 years. And of course, there has been great economic development in the South, military development in the North, and after 70 years, we are at a deadlock. So we need a third path for unification, and this is the one promoted by our founders. I just want to show again our slides. Do you see the slides? Yes. I think you all know, most of the people on this webinar know that our founders have been very much involved in the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. And one of the very important meetings they had was visiting North Korea in December 1991 to meet Kim Il-sung. Dr. and Mrs. Moon had a peace talk with North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, who once actually attempted to kill him or to have him killed, as he was an anti-communist leader. Surprisingly, an important peace agreement was signed at that time, which became a very fundamental framework of North Korea's diplomatic policy in the 1990s and the early 21st century. During that meeting, they signed an agreement which is summarized in these few points here, the decision to implement the visits of families that have been separated by the war and by the border, the 30th parallel. Also, the peaceful use of nuclear energy, the welcoming of investment by overseas Koreans, and the holding of summit talks between North and South, and the development of Mount Kumgang, the touristic development of that region. This agreement actually was implemented in the following years, both by our founders, but also by many, some South Korean companies, and of course by the South Korean political leaders. In 1998, there was a cultural exchange with a visit of the Little Angels, which is a performing troupe founded by Reverend Mrs. Moon that came to Korea, and in exchange, a boys' art group from Pyongyang came and visited Seoul. That was the first time there was a cultural exchange, between North and South after the war. And that was, of course, a preparation for a meeting of the two heads of state who signed an agreement. And the agreement that was signed in 2000, when the first time the heads of state met, that means Kim Jong-il, the son of Kim Il-sung, who had died in 1994, and Kim Dae-jung, the president of South Korea. And of course, I will not go into detail, but this agreement basically that was signed on June 15, 2000 reflects the agreement that actually was signed initially by Dr. Moon and Kim Il-sung and Dr. Moon, our founder, in Pyongyang. But there is one story, and I just want to end with that one story because it touched me, and I think it just highlights the spirit of Dr. Moon, and that story of this early time of connecting with North Korea was told by Dr. Thomas Ward, who is also my professor at UTS. So I just want to briefly share, the way he explained about after he met with President Gorbachev in Moscow in April 1990. Reverend Moon asked his staff to reach out to Kim Il-sung and assert that he was a friend of North Korea. There hadn't been any contact between North and South Korea. Actually, contacts were even forbidden. And he could help. And he proposed that he could help with the mediation with the United States. And so this actually outreach resulted in the invitation for Reverend Moon to meet with Kim Il-sung in North Korea early December 1991, as I showed in the previous slide. Reverend Moon was actually very warmly welcomed by Kim Il-sung. On the foundation of that meeting, in 1992, the American Freedom Coalition, which is an organization of political leaders in in America, founded by UPF founder Dr. Moon, organized a visit to Pyongyang of a group of 40 former US congressmen and governors, led by Congressman Eichord, whom you see on this picture with Kim Il-sung. They discussed with North Koreans on easing the US-DPRK relations, and then Kim Il-sung gave even in the Washington Times his first interview to the West. For the first time, Kim Il-sung was able to speak to the Western people through the Washington Times, which is the paper founded by our founders, UPF founders, Dr. Moon. And then right after that, in June 1992, the DPRK representative at the UN, I mean, the North Korean representative at the UN, contacted us in America and explained that in recognition for this gesture of friendliness, Kim Il-sung had decided to suspend the annual Hate America Month that year. You know, the Hate America Month is a yearly demonstration against American imperialism that is organized on the national level in North Korea between June 25 and July, which is the day of the war, and July 27, which is anniversary of the armistice. Every year, every month, they have demonstrations against America. On that year, in recognition for this effort, of Reverend Moon to bring and to reach out to North Korea, actually Kim Il-sung suspended the Hate America Month. And he called Eichord to go to the National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor of President Bush. And he said, the reason I'm asking you, President Eichord, Congressman Eichord, to give that message, because I want President Bush to understand that this was organized. This is a result of Dr. Moon's work in North Korea. So he wanted him to recognize clearly the work of Dr. Moon to create this kind of easing the tension and opening the door. And in the following years, Reverend Moon's representatives, Antonio Betancourt, Washington Times president, Dong Moon-ju, and others played various roles as informal emissaries between the US administration and DPRK leaders. So I think maybe Dr. Young will speak more about the vision of our founder, but I think that story actually testifies to the power of heart and trust building, which is the core of Dr. Moon's and Mrs. Moon's strategy to reach out to North Korea, which Mrs. Moon is pursuing at this time. Thank you very much.